Good evening. I'm Roger Lee, the chair of the Spotlight on Seattle Committee. And this is our second presentation since Anderson Hall reopened. In January, we had the head of Cascade Public Media, Rob Dunlap, and we have a program coming up this coming Monday with Mark Reddington, who is the lead architect on the Summit building, the new convention center building. And we have a lot more in store. And they're not all going to be about buildings or museums. And tonight we have the opportunity to find out what's ahead for MOHAI from the executive director, Leonard Garfield, and to enjoy a presentation that he's put together with his talk to illustrate his points. So I know many of you know Leonard Garfield and are familiar with his background, but just in case there's somebody who's not, I wanted to cover a little bit of that. This is his 23rd year as director of MOHAI. He has, as many of you know, had an amazing series of exhibits, both during his tenure, both at the location that used to be once that the highway department has taken over to help it build 520 that was once in Motley. In a very nice building designed by Rolf Kirk, I believe.
Paul Theory.
Oh, Paul Theory, excuse me, oh boy. Don't tell anybody in the architecture department. Okay. Anyway, it was a very nice building. It's too bad it's not there. But he moved MOHAI in 2012 to a new location that actually makes it more accessible to more people and more visible to visitors at South Lake Union Park. And I'm sure most of you, or at least many of you, have been there to see the exhibits. And you're looking forward to ones that are going to be mounted. A little bit of his background. He had the good fortune to attend the University of Michigan for graduate studies in American culture. And from there, he went on to the state of Wisconsin, where he served as the historian for the Office of Historic Preservation. And then he evidently decided he liked the West Coast for some reason. So he came out here and started work as a manager for the Washington State Historic Preservation Office. Then he had the opportunity to come to King County and serve as the director of the, see if I can get this straight, Office of Cultural Resources. Is that close? Okay, good. And from there, he was tapped. I hope I didn't skip anything, to go to MOHAI, where he's been ever since. He has authored a number of articles that I'm sure if you're interested, he'll be happy to list for you. All I want to mention is the book he co-authored called I'm probably not going to get this title right either.
That's okay. If you got it right, you'd be on first.
Built Washington, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Which is an architectural history of the state. Nobody could be better qualified to talk about historical architecture, or indeed any subject relating to history and industry. So thank you, Leonard. It's all yours.
No, that was a great introduction. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Eugene. We used to be neighbors in Montlake, so it's good to see you again. Neighbors in the institutional sense for me, that they live close to the old museum, which is great. You know, when we think about history, I have a thought for Horizon House. Maybe you guys have already done this, so if so, I need to know about it. Has anyone ever done a history of Horizon House and the incredible, I'm seeing nods, yes? I would love to see that because it's been such a powerful nexus of smart people, movers and shakers, and people who aren't resting on their laurels, but people who are still getting together and making things happen in our community. And I know you meet with our elected officials. Thank you for doing that. They need to hear from you. And it's just been an amazing story. And I mention that because as we have worked at really understanding Seattle history better over these many years at the Museum of History and Industry, we've often turned to the residents of Horizon House to share their stories and shed light on the history that they have made and the history that you continue to make. So I just want to, as one historian to a group of people who love history, I just want to salute you and say thank you. And as we talk about MOHAI, and Roger mentioned I've been there for a few years now, it's such a collaborative effort, and I'm going to probably goof this up a little bit, so we're going to have some audience participation to correct me, but Bobby Spaeth was on our board of trustees. There's Bobby. George and Peggy Corley have been huge allies and advocates, and Peggy was the president of the board of the Museum of History and Industry for a number of years, and George is here tonight. And in more recent years, Nancy McReynolds and Neil McReynolds, I want to thank you so much. Neil, I think you hired me. So I know everything to you. But thank you, Nancy and Neil, to all of you who have been on the board. And so many of you have been members and donors and patrons of the museum for many, many years. And if I've missed anyone because I can't see you right now, let's connect after we talk. Well, we are celebrating this month 10 years at our new location in Lake Union Park. And it has been a really exciting time for us because, as Roger said, we really did put ourselves much more physically but also culturally and civically in the center of this community. And it's been just incredible. We've had over 1 million visitors in the 10 years that we've been there. We've had hundreds of thousands of young people coming year after year, really offering them the kind of lessons in civic literacy which are so desperately needed in our community. So I thought what I would do as we go through this is to tell you a little bit about some of the exhibits that we have on display now, but also to let you know that we are in the process after 10 years of really reimagining. How can we tell stories a little bit differently? What are the stories we've left on the cutting room floor? I was just talking to Bobby about some stories that maybe we should think about including. And how can we really serve this community that's changing so much even in the last decade? Now, before I go through this, I want to mention something because Roger talked about Paul Thierick. Does anybody know who was the designer of this building, which historically was the Naval Reserve Armory? Does anybody remember what most of you probably remember when it was an armory, right? Did anybody actually serve in this armory? Anybody? Every once in a while, you know, we'll have people who've been there, their parents were there. Herb Bridge was the admiral in charge of this armory. Many of you remember Herb and John, his son, served in the armory. But Marcus Pratica was the architect. And so the great theater architect, Marcus Pratica, did this. And I want to mention that because in our midst tonight is the esteemed architectural historian of Washington State, Henry Matthews. And Henry, I just want to call you out because I think I know you longer than I've known anybody in this room because we met way decades ago, tromping through the snows of Whitman County looking for historic properties when Henry was a professor at WSU, and Susan Platt, who's here as well, has been just a great art historian and supporter of MOHAI, so I just want to call you guys out. So, let's see, I'm going to look on the controls here. I have to tell you a little inside story because of technology. I'm so lucky in my job because I get to talk with all these great technologists. So I was talking with a very famous technologist, I can't say his name, on the phone the other day, and we were on a Zoom call. He could not figure how to get off mute. Nobody can figure out this technology, but we are getting better. Well, the core exhibits of MOHAI are really built around 4 themes, and we really ask ourselves, what are the things that characterize this region in a way that may distinguish it or make it distinct from other places in the United States. You know, urban centers share an awful lot of the same history. Everybody's had a great fire, pretty much. Everybody's had waves of immigration. Everybody's had civil strife. Everybody's had interesting architecture. But what are some of the things that make Seattle unique, that hold us together as a community? And we spent several years thinking about that with historians and cultural historians, with community members and civic leaders. And we came up with 4 themes that shape our core exhibits at MOHAI. You'll never see it on the wall. It's not written on a plaque or a panel anywhere. But it helps us organize our exhibits, select our artifacts, and share our stories. And the first theme is the theme of nature. That we are a city that has been so profoundly shaped by our natural setting, and we in turn have done so much to and with that natural setting. And over time you can see the ebbs and flows of that story, to the point on the one hand we're the great leader of outdoor recreation, we've been great leaders in the extraction of natural resources, in the harvesting of timber, but we've also been an area that has damaged our natural resources and now is in the leadership of trying to remediate that issue as we tackle climate change and environmental sustainability. So nature and how it's shaped us and how we've shaped nature is a core theme. The second theme that we focused on was the theme of innovation. What an imaginative, creative place this is. Coming out to, you know, for most of our history as an American community, this is about the farthest away place you can get in the continental United States, right? So if you're coming here, you've got some kind of drive. And that sense of innovation, whether it's business innovation, cultural innovation, new ways of thinking and living, that has been a core theme that runs through all of our history. And actually it goes back to our indigenous community, which was such an innovative use of natural resources that the native community taught the arriving European Americans how to survive innovation. So that's the second core theme. The third core theme is the theme of internationalism. Thousands of years ago, the movement of indigenous people was across the Trans Mountain. It was from north and south. And that continues, of course, to the modern day, where we are so impacted by the rest of the world, and we have such an impact on the rest of the world. And that give and take of our place, not just on the national stage, but really our place within a global context. So internationalism is the third theme. And the fourth theme is community. Just how we've come together, how we've sometimes fallen apart, how we've come back together, and how we build. What are the building blocks of community? And we thought that those 4 themes are really what shape us as a Seattle community. And so you'll see that through our exhibit. Our core exhibit is called True Northwest, the Seattle Journey. And I just want to talk about some of the things that are there and some of the things we want to do differently. And invite you to join us on that process. And if you have thoughts or insights, I would love to work with you and share those. We have a very significant collection of Native American artifacts, images. This is an Edward Curtis photograph that you probably recognize the style of photography, even if you don't. We know that Curtis romanticized these images quite a bit. He was clearly staging these photographs. He was asking the subjects to pose and to wear clothing that was traditional, but perhaps not daily. So in that sense, it's ahistorical. And yet it is a beautiful evocation of enduring traditions. What we want to do at MOHAI, though, is remind people that while we have these precious photographs and the archives that represent them, we also want to remind people that indigenous culture is living. It's alive. It's always been alive. And it's as vibrant today as it was when Edward Curtis took this memorable photograph. So that will be part of our moving forward, is to try to make that feel more authentic and not simply put in the past, but to look at that as a living tradition. One of the great things about MOHAI, where we are now, is that we have a view to the community itself. Very, very few museums have actually windows that look out on anything, much less windows that look out on the majesty of this community. When we first got that building, we thought, this is crazy, it's not a museum, because there's windows everywhere. And we said, we're not going to close those windows off, which some designers have recommended. We're going to keep them open. Because that's the view to where history took place. That's where Native communities were located, but that's also where history is being made today. So as we go into the future, we'll be looking at how can we maximize the actual interaction between what's in the galleries and what's out in the community beyond the walls of the museum. So I love seeing these kids learning about the arrival of the first Europeans. And that's Captain Vancouver's ship arriving. And they're looking out and they're seeing the waterways that shaped our region, even in present days. So we want to work on that and make that exciting as well. The site itself is an amazing site for Seattle. You know, this is where the first really significant sawmill after Yesler's mill down on the central waterfront, it was David Denny's mill and the Harvard and Brace mill. And it was one of the most productive sawmills in the region, and it was literally on the site where the Armory building stands now. And then, of course, the Navy came in and took over and built the Armory, which is filled with the story of World War II and the Greatest Generation, and even stories of the Cold War, because the building stayed active as a military center until 2000. So we are literally on the site of history. As we move forward in the next 10 years as a history museum, how can we incorporate that physical history that's outside our windows? We try to find ways of integrating the actual feel of history as much as possible and make the learning of that history as fun as possible. So we tell the story of the railroad. And by the way, I just want to make note of this photograph. We have 4 million historic photographs, so someday I'll come back with a photographic show. But I'll tell you why I picked this photograph, because we all know who built the railroad, right? It was Chinese laborers. Some of them became Chinese Americans, some of them went back to China. They are almost never represented in a photograph of the building of the railroad. This, of the thousands upon thousands of photographs of the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad to Puget Sound, this is the only one where a Chinese worker is actually featured prominently, front and center. And I love it, because you know what? There's a kind of a sense of equality, of a corps d'esprit, that we all collectively built this community. And you can see that in this photograph. And so as we introduce young people to that story, we have a very, very fun interactive where they get together. They work with their classmates, some of whom they know, some of whom they don't, all their different stories and their backgrounds, and they start hammering and building those rails and those ties. And as they do that, they learn every piece of the way of how the railroad was built, what it took, who did it. You know, it's one thing to talk about James J. Hill, the empire builder, great man, did great things. But he didn't build the railroads. The railroads were built by those guys. Some of them were European Americans, some of them were Native Americans, some of them were Chinese Americans. They built that railroad, and that's the lesson that we share with young people. The Great Seattle Fire, what a transformative story. And I think a lot of you have been to MOHAI, so you kind of know this, but this is probably the most popular feature we have, because how do you tell the story of a fire that has burned down the city that we've been telling ourselves the same story for 100 years, or however, what would that be, 1889, let's see, so how many hundreds of years would that be? That would be about 140 years. And we decided to do it with a musical theater, which is great fun, where the artifacts of the fire, including the glue pot that spilled over, that actually ignited that fire, which is in the MOHAI collections on display, it becomes part of this theatrical production, which is based on a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta of the period, completely written uniquely for us. But it's a great, great fun way of telling the story. So as we go through thinking about what are we going to change, what are we going to improve, everybody said you can't change that. So, you know, it's like something you got to keep for the fun of it. I love this photograph because I love the, you know, this is like the art historian in me, this pyramidal shape where all these people are pulled together into a pyramid. This is people boarding the ships to go north to Alaska and to Canada to get rich in the gold rush. The summer of 1897, everybody in town went down to the waterfront. Of course, the mayor famously left City Hall, as, you know, theoretically his coffee cup was on the desk. But I love the immediacy of this photograph. But what's great about MOHAI is we can manifest this in the actual artifacts of the gold rush. So we have the equipment, we have the mining equipment, we have the actual photographs taken by the guys who went, and women who went north. But we also have the things that they did when they came back. The guys who came back who got rich formed the Arctic Club, and they hired a beautiful glass worker to create a kind of a Russian iconic, or you know, Susan, what would the term be? I'm looking here for, but you know, in that sort of Russian style of art, to celebrate Alaska to celebrate the riches that they had created. It was back in Seattle in 1,000 pieces, and to create this exhibit, we had art conservators pull it all together. And remember I told you those windows that are everywhere? This is actually backlit by real windows that are looking to the outside, so that illumination is not light, electrical lights, that's natural light, lighting the gallery through this prism of 1897 and hitting gold in Alaska. So being able to keep the real, authentic artifacts is a very important part of a museum's mission. Of course, we know all about the great transformations that took place here in terms of city planning, the World's Fair of 1909, the regrade, the ship canal, and we have lots of exhibits where we talk about the reshaping, Seattle by design. You know, so many young people don't realize that this city that we celebrate for its kind of natural, organic nature is one of the most heavily engineered cities in the world. Everything about this place is different than, you know, God created it. So we have a really fun interactive that shows the topography of this area at the time of European American settlement, the topography that the native community lived with. And then you push different buttons, and decade by decade, you see a change. You see the hills go down with the Denny regrade. You see the tide flats filled in. You see Harbor Island being created. By the end of it, you're brought up to the present day, and you realize that this is a city by design. It's not a city that just happened this way. And it's really that balance. How do we as a community decide what are we going to design and engineer, and what are we going to preserve because its natural state is sustaining us and healing us and giving us spiritual power? So that's one of the questions that as a museum we ask. This is such an important week in Boeing's history because, as you saw, I'm sure on the news, and some of you were there, the last delivery, the last flight of the 747 to roll off the assembly line was up in Everett the other day. And if you go back into their commercial aviation history and you look for the very first plane, that's the one. It's called the B-1. It was Bill Boeing's first use of aviation for commercial, not military purposes, and it was right there at Lake Union, right where our museum is. What I love about this story is that it's really the emblematic story of innovation, because a lot of people confuse innovation and invention. Invention, sometimes you can sit in your room by yourself and come up with something new, a new way of doing something. Innovation often is working collaboratively. It's taking existing technology and existing products and notching it forward, finding a new application. So Bill Boeing had dreamed of flight, but he knew that our legacy industry at the turn of the last century was boat building. So he thought, I'm going to get the boat builders to make a boat that flies. So the Pocock brothers, who you all know from Boys in the Boat, built the fuselage of this plane. The sailmakers out on Lake Union, who were mostly women, made the wings of the plane. He found a Chinese prodigy, a young 19-year-old man that he brought to MIT from Shanghai named Wang Su to do the aeronautical engineering, and then he flew it. He didn't need to worry about landing gear because he was going to take advantage of our water. And that's the plane, the B-1, that is really the start of, in some ways, a process that had a culmination just yesterday. And that original B-1 is hanging in the central part of our atrium. What I love about this is when we designed the museum, we found the original flight path records of the B-1 on that inaugural flight taking off from Lake Union. That building wasn't there, and that's the path that the plane actually came in on. So we're able to return it to that place of honor. So isn't that cool? And we just have a great partnership with Boeing and celebrate that story. But what are the other industries we want to talk about as well? A lot of what a history museum does is remind us of what our memories are. I was at some program the other day where someone said, my memory of Seattle is it's a place where people never crossed against red and nobody honked their horn, and what was the other thing? No one had an umbrella, something like that. And there are a lot of important things about memory that tie us together. And I look at us and I'm thinking, those memories aren't really shared intuitively by everybody unless we intentionally pass them on and use them as placemaking exercises. And so in the foreground here, this is a bad photograph, I apologize for that, but you probably recognize Slow Motion 4, which was the first hydroplane that really set the world speed record on water. It actually did that in Detroit. It was a big challenge between the plane guys in Seattle and the car guys in Detroit. Seattle won. brought the boat back, of course, but also brought with it the Gold Cup in hydroplane racing, and hence the great summertime tradition of the hydro races. And that artifact is there, not so much to say, isn't this an interesting thing, which it is, because it's a beautiful piece of engineering, but to help us go back in time to remember when a community actually came together and they were so bonded by this experience that they could all share together because they love the water. You know, summers are too short, so let's celebrate them. And we love the engineering that these guys did to make this boat fly like a plane. So that's the kind of artifact we have, and it's finding those artifacts and sharing them that is part of our mandate. Of course, Century 21 is such a iconic and important episode in our history, and it's interesting to me that we still keep referencing that as really the pivot point in our history in so many ways. I don't know if you saw, there was a little special that we did on Channel 4 a couple nights ago called How Seattle Changed the World. And it wasn't in my little part, but another guy who was a futurist was talking about the future, but what he kept coming back to was Century 21. We invented the future here, we really did, and now the future is sort of in the rearview mirror. I think the lesson from this that we want to share through the History Museum is that the future is something that we create. We don't wait for it to come, we don't sit around hoping that it will land in our laps. We actually make it happen, and that's what Seattle did. And what I love about the artifacts we have at MOHAI is we have all the artifacts that go back to actually creating the future. So I love this photograph from the MOHAI collection. It actually came to us from Packard, because Packard did all the steelwork for the Space Needle, which some people aren't aware of. But here's this photograph of this kid, probably about 12 years old, looking at that thing going up, and he's imagining this is what the future is going to be. And that's what we want all of our young people to think of when they come to the museum. We have so many artifacts. I mentioned that we have 4 million things of different sizes and shapes and characteristics, and I love the fact that we're able to share so many of them. In the foreground here in that large case, and I want to talk about that in just a second, is a beautiful robe from Japan that came to Seattle right after World War II. We were the first community in North America that reestablished relationships with our enemy in World War II, Japan. We didn't do it through the State Department because it wasn't allowed. We didn't wait for Congress to do it because it wouldn't have been possible. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do in the wake of the war to reestablish those relationships. And that robe is probably the most important symbol that came back to Seattle. But by the same token, if you look a little bit further, you see Edgar Martinez's jersey, the wonderful Edgar Martinez. What a global city we are. Edgar Martinez, the robe from Japan, and then the funky R of the Rainier R that was up on the freeway. And that's the real R that was on the freeway, because when we brought it down from the freeway, little inside story there, it's filled with bullet holes. I mean, somebody took pot shots at that R years and years ago, so I don't know, guns, I don't know, we've got to figure all of that out. But it's so fun to put these artifacts in juxtaposition and see what kind of magic they open. Now, that case that I mentioned is called the Peggy Corley case, the Peggy Corley window in Seattle history, because Peggy was our first volunteer. She was our first professional staff. She was our longtime board member, and Peggy and George have just been incredible. So that's the most important case in the museum, and we reserve it for incredibly important artifacts. And you're looking at those and you're thinking, what the heck are those 3 amazing garments, George? This is the most colorful garments you can imagine, and that's because Jimi Hendrix, the Seattle hero, would have turned 80 years old this year had he lived. And his sister Janie came to MOHAI and said, I really want to share these with MOHAI. And so we've been honored to have the garments on display in the Peggy Corley Showcase. And what a wonderful way. We've had publicity all over the world. So come to MOHAI periodically, check out the Peggy Corley case, and you'll see something changing that reflects Peggy's devotion to making sure the artifacts of our history are well taken care of and shared with the community. And speaking of artifacts, this is Starbucks. Does anybody know the names of those 3 guys? It's pre-Howard Schultz. Gordon Bowker. Zev Siegel, and who's the 3rd?
Oh, geez.
Jerry,
No, Mia.
who is it? Anyway, I always forget the 3rd person too. But Gordon donated to us So this is when they first launched the mermaid logo, right? So this is back in, I don't have my notes in front of me, but I think this is probably the early 80s. But this is the actual first Starbucks sign. So if you come to MOHAI, you'll see the photograph of the guys, pre-Howard, and you'll also see the sign, pre-mermaid, that was just a sandwich board that was put out. It was actually on First Avenue, it wasn't down in the market. And Starbucks is open, and the word open is big because the word Starbucks didn't mean anything to anybody except maybe some Moby Dick fans, right? So that's fun. But those are the kinds of artifacts that really are just unique to our history. What it says to me is that that's a hand stencil sign. That's somebody taking the time to do something with their own labor, and somehow, a couple decades later, it is one of the biggest corporations on the face of the earth, and it's created the whole concept of third place. It all begins with that sign. That is amazing. I'm having trouble putting it into words, but it's just amazing. And these guys are amazing. And we were very lucky to work with Bill Gates and with Paul on getting quite a few important artifacts associated with the early days of Microsoft, including this incredibly wonderful photograph that they gave us. But including as well some of the most recent things that Bill Gates has helped promulgate, now as a philanthropist working on global health. Off in the distance there, it's a portable vaccine delivery device. It's a way of keeping vaccines safe and fresh and going that last mile to the most remote places on Earth. And that came out of the philanthropy of Bill Gates, the genius of technologists. Even guys at Boeing collaborated on working on what's called the portable vaccine delivery device. So that's in our exhibits as well. And we have a whole focus at the museum, and this is largely thanks to the philanthropy of Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Bezos, an innovation center. So you'll be seeing some changes there as well, because we opened with a real focus on economic innovation and business innovation, and that would make sense because Jeff Bezos is such an amazing businessman. But we also recognized in working on the topic that there's cultural innovation and there's environmental innovation, and we all innovate in different ways. And we want every young person to know that they're part of that heritage of innovation, and that pipeline that sometimes is a little too narrow, a little bit tilted towards guys, a little bit tilted towards upper income school districts, we want that to be a tradition that every young person is a part of. We have a third floor and a fourth floor at the museum you don't see as much of, but the fourth floor is our Maritime Gallery. We work in partnership with our colleagues at the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society, and we're doing some updates there. We have some wonderful pieces of art that are in our collection. You might recognize this artist. I included it because you have a large piece by John Grady, which I think is in your lobby. I do believe, where is it now? It's in the dining hall. And I do believe Phyllis Lanphier probably had something to do with that. She had something to do with this too, I suspect. And there it is. It's an amazing piece. I won't go into the storyline on that. We have a theater with some great videos and films about Seattle history and heritage. And every artifact you see at the museum has been carefully preserved. We don't just take stuff and put it on display. One of the reasons why it's hard to get as many things on display as we'd like to is that there is painstaking restoration. This is the Smith Island Lighthouse, if you can imagine. So that Fresnel lens is being carefully restored by the curators. Here's a figurehead from a tall-masted sailing ship from the late 19th century that's being carefully preserved. All of these things are now on display, but the work that goes into it, and just physically to get things into the museum. I sometimes think, oh, I wish we were an art museum, because a lot of things are just in a frame, although we know sculptures can be really big too. But getting hydroplanes and trucks and cars is a big undertaking, so we work really hard to get exciting things on display. I know that I'm probably running out of time, so let me just quickly talk about some of the programs we do. We have a very extensive educational program. One of my favorites is something we call our Innovation Classroom, where we ask young kids to come to the museum and to learn about the history of innovation in our region, from indigenous times, current times, all kinds of innovations. And then to think about what are the characteristics of being an innovator. It's collaboration, it's risk-taking, it's listening to others, it's trying to find imaginative ways of tackling old, intractable problems. And we ask the kids then to go back to their classrooms after a couple sessions and to think about what's the problem that needs innovative solutions in your life, in your neighborhood, in your household. and then to work on together with a group and solve those problems at maker spaces, come back to the museum, present those, and they become part of the museum collection on display for a period of time. And when we first launched this program about 10 years ago, we thought, well, they're going to do like backpacks that fly and, you know, things that are fun and like that. And they came back with things like, how do I create a safe schoolroom? How do I deal with hunger? How do I deal with the homeless people that are in my community? Amazing, amazing, powerful, really moving takes by young people who actually have come up with some pretty amazing solutions. So I'm really proud of that program. I'll flip through some of this. And we work with kids both in a classroom setting as well as hands-on in the exhibits. We have teen programs. We call them our MOHAI Youth Advisors. And we ask them to actually consult with us. We give them a little stipend. We kind of put them to work. And we say we want that youth perspective. These are teenagers and kids who are about to go off to college. And then we just have lots of programs of every sort. We try to think about history in ways that aren't, you know, just behind a glass case or that you might expect. So we've done things on the history of hip-hop or the history of the environment or things, or music history we've tried to appeal to. We've had programs that brought people from throughout the region. This is an international program we did with Microsoft, where we invited young innovators who were working on a historic project based on some earlier innovation to come, and they were from all over the world and came and enjoyed that. We have programs for toddlers, so if you have grandkids or great-grandkids who might enjoy playing, and sort of the building blocks of history really begin with your own household. How do you understand how you factor into your home environment? That's kind of how we start talking about community and history. And we have fun doing that. We, of course, like many museums, we have great summer camps. But we also have programs for young professionals and emerging people where they tackle community problems, look at the history of those problems, and then figure out solutions that are based on understanding that history. This was one of our Idea Lab cohorts and classes a couple of years ago. Lots of panel discussions about all aspects of history. This is Larry Gossett and the late Uncle Bob Santos, yep. And I think Enrique Sone is moderating that, is that right? So we do every aspect of Seattle history. And we also use the park in front of us for festivals and different outdoor kinds of things. So as we reimagine for the next 10 years, we want to do a lot more with that. So we really want to activate the park. And I recently formed a Friends of Lake Union Park to put a little bit more pressure on the Parks Department to keep that park clean and safe and healthy and open for all kinds of families to enjoy it, because we want our parks to be places where families can enjoy it. Now, something you maybe did not know is, in addition to our museum in the Armory building, we do have a back-of-house facility that we call our MOHAI Resource Center. It's actually called the McQuaid Resource Center in honor of Tom McQuaid, who some of you may know is a very generous benefactor of ours. And it's where we keep all of our artifacts. So if you were to sneak back there, I'd love to do a tour for Horizon House. And George, I think you maybe have been here, maybe Neil and Nancy, you have been, but this is where all the fun stuff is when it's not on display. So that's not the PI globe, we have that, but that's the original PI neon sign, the very first neon sign in Seattle. It's not lit up there. Remember Warshall's from down on 2nd Avenue, and the doghouse and different things like that. We also have a research library, which includes all of our photographs and many archives and documents, and we publish books from time to time. We have the complete collection of Al Smith's photographs, really the unique photographer of the African American experience in Seattle, an amazing photographer, and we published a book recently. We've done several books. We have a history trail out in the park, so if you don't want to come into the museum, you can pick up some history tidbits wandering through the park. That's kind of fun. I think Phyllis had a role in that too. I think Phyllis had a role in like a lot of this stuff. But here's what we're going to be doing in the next year. And some of you maybe have heard about this. We have a wonderful, ignore the press preview, that's a program that Susan was at a few days ago, but the actual opening of this exhibit is this Saturday. It's called From the Ground Up, Black Architects and Designers. It's the first national outing for a show from the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, but we're adding to it a component that includes a focus on Seattle architects as well. So it's a story that's not often told and one that really should get more attention, so we're looking forward to that. Now, Bobby has the actual book here, but how many of you know Mary Henry or remember Mary Henry?
She's spoken here.
And she's spoken here. So this is her book. She did the original edition a few years ago, and now it's been reissued. look, it's already published, and she's going to give her first program Wednesday, February 15th. So you can actually see Mary. She's, I know it's not like to talk about people's ages, but why not? She's 99, she's going to turn 100, and we're just so amazed because she's unbelievable. She, by the way, has an amazing history herself. She and her family really broke the color code in housing. You know, there was all that de facto segregation in Seattle, all through our neighborhoods. We all know that. And Mary and her husband, Dr. Henry, had the courage and the persistence and the valor to actually break that barrier, and it was not easy. There were some things that we would be very ashamed of as Seattleites that happened to them. But nonetheless, the family's an amazing family, and Mary's an amazing historian, so you might want to come to that program. Then we're going to have some panel discussions that feature Black architects in our own community talking about the work that they've done. And then in April, we're taking a look at space, and all of our space players, Blue Origin and Boeing and some other players are coming to our Innovation Exchange. And then in the summer, we're having an exhibit. Some of you have probably seen at different museums the Nettie Awards. They're sponsored by the Benke Foundation and Cornish College, and they celebrate the best visual artist of the year. They've done it for 25 years, so we're doing something we don't usually do, which is a pretty straight-up art exhibit. We're going to look at a quarter century of the Nettie Award to see how the history of art has changed in our region over that time period. And there are something like 50 winners, and almost every single one of them will be represented. So lots of names that you'll recognize, and a lot of art that you'll just be, I think, it will be both reminiscent, but it'll also be very inspiring. And then we end the year with a wonderful show from the in partnership with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, called Native Knowledge, Shared Science, and it's a look at native traditions that somehow sustain the environment for millennia, and modern science, which is really also trying to do that, coming together to address the existential threat of global climate change. I think it's going to be a really important exhibit, so I hope you'll join us for that, which opens up at the end of the year and goes into next year. And that is kind of where we are. So we're planning over the next couple of years a lot of interesting redesigns and re-investigations into Seattle history. We've got some interesting traveling shows that will come, and I absolutely welcome you to join us at MOHAI. Come visit, join us, become a member, and always happy to speak to Horizon House because, you know, as I say, you guys are history. So, and I mean that in the best sense of the word. But thank you. Oh, good question, Susan. Yeah, so Susan was asking about the pink elephant, which we all know from down there on Denny. We do have the pink elephant. We have the big pink elephant. There were two pink elephants. There was the giant one that you all saw, and on the same space, there was a smaller pink elephant. So Amazon, because they're poor and have no resources, took the smaller one, and we got the big one, and it's like, so we're struggling with it. But Western Neon, which is really the preeminent neon restoration firm in town, really in the Northwest, has done a wonderful job of restoring it, and now we're really trying to figure out how we can display it, because it wouldn't fit into this room, for example. So we're challenged by it. But my goal would be, let's get it out in Lake Union Park, at least in some kind of temporary display, because it's so fun. And on a wet, rainy, early night in the winter, like, it wasn't today, but maybe tomorrow will be this way. It'd be fun to see that elephant all lit up in Lake Union. So yes, we do have, we also have the PI Globe, but same challenge, it's like the Hearst Corporation and the people who own the building where it is, which is Credit Suisse, and MOHAI. It's like the Hearst Corporation, Credit Suisse, and MOHAI. How can we make this work? And it's like, okay, MOHAI's going to figure out how to make this work. We got to get the other people to help us, but that's something that we're determined to keep on the landscape, and the Hearst Corporation has agreed they will contribute to that. So hopefully that will get relit sometime in the next couple of years.
I seem to remember this clock tower in downtown Seattle. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's right. Does anybody remember which one that was?
Yeah.
Carol's clock. And the people who owned the Carroll family, you guys might remember this, Roger and Gene, lived across the lake from MOHAI. So when they had to remove the clock because they were closing their business, they still wanted to be able to see the clock. So they gave it to MOHAI. That was another challenge of moving, but we moved it in the old place at Montlake. And of course it just became a beloved part of our collection, so now it has a place of honor down Lake Union Park. Yeah, unfortunately, that clock has stopped telling time about a year ago. And there is one guy who knows how to fix these clocks, and he lives in Port Townsend, and he, as you can imagine, is a little bit older, and it's like, if when he passes, we're going to have a lot, we, meaning all the clock owners, there are about 10 of us in Seattle, are really going to have some trouble keeping these things working. So it's possible that moving into the future it might have to be mechanized, or not mechanized, it is mechanized, but digitized somehow. But right now it's all the real stuff, and it doesn't work. So that's the drawback of real stuff.
What's your relationship with the Center for Wooden Boats?
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because George is a gigantic supporter and leader there. We're just great program partners, and the center, as you know, has a beautiful new building by Olson Koendig. They've got great programs. They have a wonderful young director named Josh Anderson, and they just do great programs. And if you want to get on the water, you have a young person in your life, that's the place to go. It really is, and they're just great. So I love having that, that hands-on history, and boat building and boat crafts, and then getting on the water, what they're all about.
And becoming a member?
Becoming a member, go on mohai.org and join, or just come in the front door and say you want to be a member. That's the way to do it.
I'm going to steal the microphone because tell a little bit about your relationship with the Virginia 5, which I think is the only floating designated on the National Register property that I know of in our region that's actually floating.
Yeah, it's actually floating. That's a good point. Well, the Virginia 5 is its own separate organization, and I am happy to say they have a new director as of a day ago. I'm probably not even allowed to say that, but a wonderful person that you'll be very pleased to hear, and I'll wait for them to do the official announcement. But they have been in dry dock for a couple of years, being restored, and they are back, and they are booming. And there are going to be 2 tours this summer with MOHAI and the Virginia 5. We're going to take people out on the boat. It's a wonderful experience if you haven't done it, because it's the last of the actually functioning mosquito fleet. Yeah. So the only one in the world, and this is how we all got around. So this summer, if you want to add a fun boat tour with beautiful views and a little bit of history, Virginia 5 and MOHAI are going to partner on that. So,
if anyone is writing a book, and needs illustrations and photographs, Museum of History and Industry can supply them at about 1/10 of the cost. If you go to the newspapers, it's $200. And how much is it now at the Museum of History?
it's not $200, but I'm taking notes. But no, it's so affordable. But I'll tell you, thank you for saying that, because we have so many photographs, and it's so affordable. If you are doing your own family history, your community, your church history, it's a great place to check. The thing about photographs, to be honest with you, is so many of them have fallen, not fallen into the public domain, but they've been basically stolen. And because everybody downloads them from the internet, that we realize that trying to place artificial barriers around price is not the way to share history. So we try to keep it really affordable.
It was $35 at MOHAI and $200 at Seattle Times for a photograph.
There you go. I'm learning, it's like all these companies are charging more money than we are.
Do you want to say something about your capital campaign?
I would. Now, who said that? Raise your hand. Oh, Roger. Well, how did you know we have a capital? All nonprofits have capital campaigns, right? It's a part of the... Well, actually, I don't know if I'd call it a capital campaign as much as a campaign to reimagine our core exhibit. So all the work I've been talking about will be turning to some of that for the community. We do have a couple of very nice lead gifts. The reimagining project will be about a $25 million project. So it's very expensive to do this right. But we're determined to work with the community, to take the time to do it right, to find a new technology, all this stuff. I was just meeting with some people from Microsoft today, and all that open AI stuff where all you have to do is say, please create a museum exhibit, and then pop, it happens. We're going to be doing some of that. So it's going to be there's a price tag with it, but we really want it to be a community-based project. So we'll be coming to folks, and a little premature now, I think. I don't really have too much to share with you on that, but.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Part of your talk about the placement of the new building and the history of the great, and one thing I'm from here, and one thing in my mind is a painting actually that Emily Carr did of the Lake Union area. Like, what was this? Like 1920 is what's in my mind, but it's probably earlier than that. But it'd be a great piece to have in your, as a historical
Yeah, that would be
transformation
absolutely wonderful. We have, there, Emily Carr, in that era, we have a nice collection of art that's pre-Northwest School. So we know the Northwest School, which of course is wonderful. You have some pieces right here in Horizon House, and of course Sam Zellert Museum has quite a bit. But there was an even earlier period of artists who worked here who really were quite remarkable from the late 19th and into the early 20th century. So we're lucky we have some of that. One of my favorite pieces from an art perspective is some of the works of Kenneth Callahan. I think you guys have Callahan work here, right? Yeah. And some of his WPA work, which is really wonderful, wonderful stuff, is on display at the museum. So I'm really pleased that we have that.
Do you have anything that relates to the Sandy Bradley show?
Okay, now you're going back to the old days. Yeah, because that used to be done at MOHAI. I don't know that we do, Roger. We should go, right? Yeah. We used to do the Sandy Bradley show. Remember Jim French Mystery Theater? We did that. We did all kinds of things. The one advantage of the old spot, which was sort of, as you said, unceremoniously torn down, is it had a wonderful auditorium, 400 seats. It was a very sweet spot in the community because there were 1,000+ auditoriums and there were intimate auditoriums, but there weren't too many in that mid-range, and we had one of the few. And we had a grand piano and all that great stuff. And that I miss. We miss having that. But the Armory is a funny building. It doesn't have a basement because it's literally sitting on pilings. So if you go into that John Gray sculpture, you can look down and you'll see the water. And it doesn't have an attic because it's got a big, big open atrium. So there's no place to really create black box experiences. So it's just a big ceiling and no basement and lots of windows. So if you had to design a museum, you wouldn't do any of those things. So I know that Mark is coming and speaking to you from LMN. LMN was the architects, and they did such a respectful job of preserving the significant features of that building and making it work for a museum without changing the historic character. So I give a lot of kudos to LMN who worked on that project. Well, thank you. If there aren't any others, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.